Listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you isn't just another political story. This is about the President of the United States standing in the White House, surrounded by his cabinet secretaries, and calling American citizens garbage. This is about federal agents flooding into Minneapolis neighborhoods, pulling over U.S. citizens, demanding papers based on how they look. This is about a member of Congress being targeted not for her votes or her policies, but for where she was born and what she looks like. And this is happening right now in December 2024 in the United States of America. On December 2nd, President Donald Trump sat in a cabinet meeting at the White House. The press was there, cameras were rolling, his cabinet secretaries surrounded the table. A reporter asked him a question about Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, and Trump didn't just answer the question. He launched into something else entirely. He started talking about Somali immigrants. He started talking about Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. And what he said wasn't a policy disagreement, it wasn't a political critique. It was something darker. We can go one way or the other, and we're going to go the wrong way if we keep taking in garbage into our country, Trump said, his voice carrying the weight of presidential authority. Then he looked directly at the cameras. Ilhan Omar is garbage. She's garbage. Her friends are garbage. He wasn't done. I don't want them in our country. I'll be honest with you. I don't want them in our country. Their country is no good for a reason. Their country stinks, and we don't want them in our country. Think about that for a moment. The President of the United States, speaking from the White House, in an official capacity, calling a sitting member of Congress garbage, telling American citizens to go back to where they came from, using the formal apparatus of government to dehumanize people based on their national origin and ethnicity. This wasn't a late-night tweet. This wasn't an off-the-cuff remark at a campaign rally. This was deliberate. This was the president using the power and prestige of his office to target a specific community and a specific person. Ilhan Omar responded on social media with striking restraint. "His obsession with me is creepy," she wrote. "I hope he gets the help he desperately needs." But behind those words lies a reality that's genuinely frightening, because Trump's words weren't just words, they were a signal, they were permission, and federal law enforcement was already moving. Just as Trump made these statements, Immigration and Customs Enforcement launched what they called Operation Metro Surge. Approximately 100 ICE agents descended on the Twin Cities from all over the country. They came from Florida, they came from Texas, they set up staging areas in federal buildings in St. Paul, and they started making arrests. Not just arrests of people with deportation orders, not just arrests of people convicted of serious crimes. They were sweeping up anyone who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, speaking the wrong language, looking the wrong way. The numbers tell part of the story. From January 20th to October 15th of this year, ICE arrested 1,694 people in Minnesota. Then Operation Metro Surge began. In just 1 week, they arrested more than 400 people. Think about that acceleration. Think about what it means when federal agents flood into a major American city and start detaining people at that rate. But numbers don't capture what's actually happening on the streets of Minneapolis. On East Lake Street, in the heart of the city's Latino and Somali business corridor, people watched as ICE agents pulled individuals off the sidewalk. Daniel Hernandez, who owns Colonial Market and Restaurant, described seeing people snatched from the streets. He said there are hundreds of stories like his along Lake Street. The businesses are struggling. Some have closed entirely. Employees were detained. Customers are terrified to come. The tables at Plaza Mexico sit empty. Some stalls have their lights off. ICE agents showed up in unmarked vehicles wearing face masks, vests that said police. Local law enforcement doesn't wear face masks. Their vehicles are clearly marked with city or county names. But ICE wanted to blur those lines. They wanted people unsure who they were dealing with. And it worked. Fear spread through the community like wildfire. At Riverside Plaza, home to many Somali residents, people stopped going outside unless absolutely necessary. Parents were afraid to send their kids to school. Elderly residents canceled medical appointments. Young people felt anxious simply walking down the street, because when the president calls your community garbage and tells you to go back where you came from, and then federal agents appear in your neighborhood pulling people over, you understand the message being sent. And here's what makes this even more chilling. They were detaining U.S. citizens. A Somali man was grabbed during his lunch break. Customers shouted that he was a U.S. citizen. ICE agents ignored them. They hauled him to a federal facility, then told him to walk home through the snow after admitting they had no cause to detain him. Another incident involved a Somali woman taken from downtown Minneapolis, mocked for wearing a hijab, and held for 24 hours until her family proved yet again that a U.S. passport apparently isn't enough protection if you're a black Muslim woman. Even Congresswoman Omar's son was pulled over by ICE agents. He showed his U.S. passport. They let him go. But think about what that means. The son of a member of Congress, an American citizen, pulled over by federal immigration agents in his own country. If that can happen to him, it can happen to anyone in that community. To understand why this is happening, we need to understand who the Somali American community in Minnesota actually is. These aren't illegal immigrants. These are refugees who came to this country legally through proper channels, fleeing one of the most brutal civil wars of the late 20th century. In the early 1990s, Somalia descended into chaos. The government of Siad Barre collapsed. Clan warfare erupted. Mogadishu became a battlefield. Hundreds of thousands of people fled. More than 1 million Somalis became refugees, scattered across East Africa, in camps in Kenya, Ethiopia, and beyond. Another 1.5 million were internally displaced within Somalia itself. The United Nations worked with the United States and other countries to resettle these refugees. Minnesota began accepting Somali primary refugees in 1993. At first it was hundreds, then it became thousands. But it didn't start in Minneapolis. Some of the first Somali refugees in Minnesota went to a town called Marshall, about 150 miles west of Minneapolis. There was a turkey processing plant there that needed workers. The jobs didn't require English proficiency. They paid immediately. For refugees who had spent years in camps with nothing, who needed to send money back to family members still in East Africa, these jobs were lifelines. Word spread through the Somali community using traditional communication networks. When some found work and stability, they told others. Families reunited, more refugees arrived. They found jobs not just in meat processing but in hospitality, driving taxis, working in warehouses. They settled primarily in the Twin Cities because that's where the opportunities were, where the schools were good, where resettlement agencies like Lutheran Social Services, Catholic Charities, and the International Institute of Minnesota had experience helping refugees establish new lives. The Cedar Riverside neighborhood in Minneapolis became the heart of the community. The Confederation of Somali Community in Minnesota was established there in 1994, the first Somali organization to help refugees resettle. Mosques were built, cultural centers opened, businesses flourished. The Carmel Mall became regionally famous, offering everything from halal meat to leather shoes to gold jewelry, money transfer offices, and groceries from home. Today, Minnesota is home to somewhere between 80,000 and 108,000 people of Somali descent. That's the largest Somali community in the United States, representing about 40% of all Somalis in America. It's more than 4 times the Somali American population of Ohio, which has the second largest community. And here's the crucial fact that keeps getting ignored in the political attacks. The vast majority of Somali Minnesotans are American citizens. Some were born here, others became naturalized citizens. According to census data, only about 5% of Minnesota's Somali population are non-citizens, and many of those have legal permanent residency or asylum applications pending. These are people who've built lives here. They own 600 businesses in Minnesota. They contribute between $164 million and $494 million in purchasing power. They're doctors, teachers, police officers, and elected officials. They're serving on city councils in Minneapolis and St. Paul. They're in the Minnesota State Legislature, and one of them made history in a way that would have seemed impossible when the first refugees arrived in the 1990s. Her name is Ilhan Omar, and her story is the American dream in its purest form. She was born in Mogadishu, Somalia, on October 4th, 1982. She grew up in Baidoa, in southern Somalia. She was the youngest of 7 siblings. Her father, Nur Omar Mohammed, was a colonel in the Somali army. Her mother, Fadhuma Abukar Haji Hussein, died when Ilhan was only 2 years old. When the Civil War erupted, the Omar family fled. They ended up in a refugee camp in Dadaab, Kenya. For 4 years they lived there. 4 years of uncertainty, of waiting, of hoping for a chance at something better. Ilhan's grandfather never stopped talking about democracy, about the importance of people having a voice in their government. He had lived through colonization. He had lived through dictatorship. He wanted his granddaughter to experience something different. In 1995, the United States granted the Omar family refugee status. They arrived in New York, then moved to Arlington, Virginia, before finally settling in Minneapolis. Ilhan was 12 years old. She spoke only Somali. She wore a hijab, which made her stand out in school. She faced bullying because of her appearance, because of her religion, because she was different. But her grandfather and father kept emphasizing the importance of civic engagement. At age 14, Ilhan started accompanying her grandfather to Democratic Farmer Labor Party caucus meetings, serving as his interpreter. She watched neighbors come together to advocate for change at the grassroots level. She fell in love with the democratic process, with the idea that ordinary people could make their voices heard, could change things, could build something better together. She graduated from Edison High School in Minneapolis in 2001. She earned both a Bachelor of Arts and a Bachelor of Science from North Dakota State University in 2011. She worked as a community nutrition educator at the University of Minnesota. She served as a child nutrition outreach coordinator at the Minnesota Department of Education. She managed political campaigns. She worked as a senior policy aide for the Minneapolis City Council, and then she decided to run for office herself. In 2016, Ilhan Omar ran for a seat in the Minnesota House of Representatives. She was challenging a 44-year incumbent in the Democratic primary. Nobody gave her much chance, but she won. She became the first Somali American woman to serve in the Minnesota State Legislature. She became the first woman to wear a hijab in the Minnesota Legislature. 2 years later, in 2018, Congressman Keith Ellison announced he was running for Minnesota Attorney General, leaving his seat in the 5th Congressional District open. Omar decided to run. Minnesota's 5th District includes Minneapolis and surrounding suburbs. It's one of the most Democratic districts in the country. Omar won the primary with 48.2% of the vote. In the general election, she won with 78%. On January 3, 2019, Ilhan Omar was sworn into the United States House of Representatives. She became the first Somali American elected to Congress. She became the first African refugee to serve in Congress. She became one of the first two Muslim women elected to Congress, along with Rashida Tlaib of Michigan. She became the first woman of color to represent Minnesota in Congress. And the House of Representatives voted to overturn a 181-year-old ban on head coverings on the House floor so she could wear her hijab while performing her duties. That's the American dream. A refugee who arrived speaking no English, who spent 4 years in a camp in Kenya, who faced discrimination and bullying, who worked her way through college, who gave back to her community, who ran for office, who won, and who now serves in the United States Congress representing the people of Minnesota's 5th District. That's what America promises. That's what we say we are. But Donald Trump has been attacking Ilhan Omar since before she even took office. In July 2019, he posted on social media telling Omar and other progressive congresswomen of color to go back and help fix the totally broken and crime-infested places from which they came. The House of Representatives passed a resolution condemning his comments as racist. Trump didn't back down. He doubled down. At a rally in North Carolina, his supporters chanted, "Send her back," while Trump stood silently on stage, letting it happen. Now, in December 2024, Trump is escalating. On Thanksgiving, he posted on Truth Social that hundreds of thousands of refugees from Somalia are completely taking over the once great state of Minnesota. Somalian gangs are roving the streets looking for prey as our wonderful people stay locked in their apartments and houses, hoping against hope that they will be left alone. There's no evidence for these claims. Minnesota crime statistics don't support them. But Trump doesn't need evidence. He needs a villain. He needs someone to blame. He needs someone to point at and say, "They're the problem." Then came the cabinet meeting on December 2nd. Then came Operation Metro Surge. Then came the threat to end temporary protected status for Somali immigrants. Here's what's important to understand about that last threat. Only about 700 Somalis in the United States have TPS. That's out of more than 260,000 people of Somali descent living in America. It's a tiny fraction of the community. Most Somali immigrants didn't come through TPS. They came as refugees, which is a different permanent legal pathway that includes vetting, resettlement support, and eventual access to green cards and citizenship. So why threaten to end TPS for 700 people? Because it's not really about those 700 people. It's about sending a message to the entire community. It's about creating fear and uncertainty. It's about making every Somali immigrant, every Somali American citizen, feel like they're not wanted, like they don't belong, like they could be next. And Trump is using the massive fraud scandal in Minnesota as justification for all of this. He needs to justify his attacks. So he's pointing to the Feeding Our Future scheme and other fraud cases and saying, "See, this is what Somalis do." Let's be clear about what actually happened with these fraud cases, because the truth is more complicated than the political rhetoric suggests. Between roughly 2017 and 2022, a massive fraud operation unfolded in Minnesota targeting federal social service programs. The largest piece of it involved a nonprofit called Feeding Our Future, which was supposed to be distributing federal child nutrition funds to provide meals for low-income children. Instead, the organization and its affiliated sites were submitting false meal count sheets, fake invoices, and fraudulent attendance rosters to steal money meant for hungry kids. The mastermind of the Feeding Our Future scheme was a woman named Amy Bach. She's white, not Somali. Federal prosecutors described her as the ringleader. She was convicted and sentenced to prison, but many of the people who worked with her, who set up the fraudulent meal sites, who submitted the fake paperwork, were members of Minnesota's Somali community. Out of 78 people charged in the Feeding Our Future case, most are of Somali descent. 56 have been convicted so far. The fraud wasn't limited to Feeding Our Future. Prosecutors uncovered similar schemes targeting autism services and housing stabilization programs. In total, federal prosecutors say the fraud across all these programs could exceed $1 billion. That's a staggering amount of taxpayer money stolen from programs meant to help vulnerable people. Conservative politicians and media have seized on this. They're pointing to the fact that many of the defendants are Somali and saying this proves something about the community as a whole. President Trump has repeatedly referenced the fraud in his attacks on Minnesota's Somali population. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent announced an investigation into whether any of the stolen money made its way to Al-Shabaab, the terrorist group that controls parts of Somalia. Here's what federal investigators actually say about that terrorism link. There's no evidence for it. Multiple federal investigators told CBS News they haven't found any connection between the fraud money and terrorist financing. An Obama-era U.S. attorney who worked on these cases said the defendants were looking to get rich, not fund overseas terrorism. Some defendants did wire money overseas, including to banks in China and Kenya. But there's a huge difference between individuals sending money abroad and funding terrorist organizations. And here's what gets lost in the political attacks. This fraud was perpetrated by individuals, not by a community. The Somali American community has about 83,000 people in the Twin Cities area. A few dozen people committed fraud. That means 99.9% of the community had nothing to do with it. But Trump is using the crimes of a few dozen individuals to justify targeting an entire ethnic community with federal law enforcement operations and with rhetoric that dehumanizes tens of thousands of innocent people. This is collective punishment. When ICE deploys 100 agents to Minneapolis, specifically after the president calls Somalis garbage, when they're setting up operations in neighborhoods where Somalis live, when they're pulling over people who look Somali and demanding papers, that's not targeted law enforcement. That's ethnic profiling. That's using the apparatus of the federal government to terrorize a community based on national origin. The legal and constitutional problems with this approach are profound. The Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment prohibits selective enforcement of laws based on race, national origin, or ethnicity. If ICE is targeting Somali immigrants because they're Somali, not because they've actually violated immigration law, that's unconstitutional. Civil rights organizations, including the ACLU, are already preparing lawsuits. Congresswoman Omar has demanded answers from the Department of Homeland Security about the legal basis for Operation Metro Surge and about documented incidents of racial profiling, unlawful arrests of U.S. citizens, excessive force, and violations of constitutional rights. But the constitutional problems go even deeper. We have three co-equal branches of government. The executive branch, which Trump leads, enforces the laws. The legislative branch, which includes Congress, makes the laws. The judicial branch interprets them. That separation of powers is fundamental to everything else. When the president singles out a member of Congress by name, calls her garbage, questions her loyalty, and then directs federal law enforcement resources toward her community, he's not just being rude. He's undermining the independence of the legislative branch. He's sending a message that if you criticize him, if you oppose him, he'll use every tool at his disposal to punish you and the people you represent. Think about what that means. Ilhan Omar is an elected member of the United States House of Representatives. She represents the people of Minnesota's 5th Congressional District. Those people chose her to be their voice in Washington. She votes on legislation. She serves on committees. She questions administration officials. That's her job. That's what representatives do in a democracy. But Trump is treating her not as a co-equal member of a co-equal branch of government, but as a personal enemy to be attacked and whose constituents should be targeted. The community impact of all this has been devastating. Businesses along Lake Street have lost significant revenue. Some are barely surviving. Daniel Hernandez said his restaurant's struggle will soon have ripple effects because business owners in the area pay other businesses throughout Minnesota to supply them with meat and other products. When the immigrant-owned businesses fail, those supply chains suffer too. Ramiro Hernandez, who owns Buy More Supermercado in St. Paul, has started delivering groceries to people too afraid to leave their homes. He's doing it free of charge. "This is not a time to make money," he told reporters. "This is a time just to survive." His store is delivering to dozens of people per day, families who are too terrified to walk down the street to buy food. The Minnesota chapter of the Council on American Islamic Relations organized a day of action for Somali businesses in the Cedar Riverside neighborhood, encouraging people to patronize the businesses, to learn about the community, to show solidarity. Jailani Hussein, the council's executive director, said parents are worried about sending their kids to school, elders feel unsafe going to appointments, and young people feel anxious about simply being outside. "The emotional toll is real," he said, "but there's also been resistance. There's been mobilization." More than 100 people rallied outside a Target store on East Lake Street, demanding that Target prohibit ICE from using their parking lots to stage operations. Immigrant advocacy groups have been documenting ICE activities, following their vehicles, blowing whistles to alert communities when agents are present. Protesters have tried to block ICE vehicles, have aggressively tailed agents, have even attached Apple Air tags to ICE vehicles to track their movements. Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey signed an executive order barring ICE from using any city-owned spaces. St. Paul Mayor Melvin Carter spoke out forcefully against the operations, calling Trump's comments racist, Islamophobic, and xenophobic. Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan appeared on CNN saying the increased federal presence is spreading fear and making the community less safe, not safer. Community leaders, politicians, and faith leaders have held interfaith prayer services for the Somali community. White neighbors who understand that the Constitution protects everyone have stood alongside their Somali neighbors, some even getting brutalized by federal agents for trying to lawfully observe what was happening. This is what America looks like when it's tested. When a president tries to use fear and division as political weapons, some people stand up. Some people refuse to accept it. Some people remember what we're supposed to be about. But the test itself is dangerous, because every day this continues, the damage accumulates. What happens to other immigrant communities watching this? If the president can call Somali Americans garbage and direct federal enforcement operations against them, what's to stop him from doing the same to Mexican Americans? To Venezuelan Americans? To Haitian Americans? Remember during the campaign when Trump and J.D. Vance falsely claimed that Haitian immigrants in Ohio were eating people's cats and dogs? That lie spread across the country. Haitian communities faced harassment and threats. Now we're seeing the sequel with Somalis. Who's next? This damages America's credibility internationally. How do we tell other countries to accept refugees when our own president is calling refugees garbage? How do we lecture others about human rights when we're engaging in what looks like ethnic targeting at home? How do we maintain moral authority on anything when we're systematically dehumanizing vulnerable communities for political gain? But here's what gives me hope in all this. The Somali American community is not backing down. Congresswoman Omar wrote in an op-ed that Somali Minnesotans remain resilient against the onslaught of attacks from the White House. She acknowledged the danger, the increased death threats she and her family receive every time Trump attacks her, but she also said, "We will not let him intimidate or debilitate us. We are not afraid." That resilience comes from lived experience. These are people who survived a civil war. They survived years in refugee camps. They built new lives in a foreign country where they didn't speak the language, where the climate was colder than anything they'd ever known, where they faced discrimination and suspicion. And they thrived anyway. They built businesses. They raised children. They became citizens. They got elected to office. They achieved the American dream despite every obstacle. They're not going to let Donald Trump take that away from them. They understand something profound. America, at its best, is bigger than any one person, bigger than any one president, bigger than any political movement based on fear and division. The promise of America, the real promise, is that it doesn't matter where you came from or what you look like or what language your parents spoke. What matters is whether you embrace the values, whether you contribute, whether you believe in the possibility of something better. Ilhan Omar said her grandfather chose America over Norway or Canada because he believed America was a true democracy, where his granddaughter could eventually become American. Not Norwegian American, not Somali American, just American. That was the promise. That was the dream. And 30 years later, his granddaughter represents her district in the United States Congress. That's what's at stake here. Not just the safety and dignity of one community in Minnesota, not just the career of one controversial congresswoman. What's at stake is whether we're going to maintain the democratic norms and constitutional principles that have held this country together for nearly 250 years. Whether we're going to be a nation of laws or a nation where the president can target ethnic communities with federal power based on his personal grievances. Whether we're going to uphold the promise we make to refugees and immigrants or tear it up when it becomes politically convenient. This is the choice before us. This is the test. And every one of us has to decide what side of history we want to be on. Do we stand with the Somali American community in Minnesota? Do we demand that our government respect the Constitution and treat all people with dignity? Do we insist that members of Congress should be evaluated on their work, not attacked for their ethnicity? Or do we stay silent while the president calls American citizens garbage and federal agents flood into neighborhoods to terrorize people based on how they look? The Somali community in Minnesota is watching. Every immigrant community in America is watching. The world is watching. History is watching. And what we do now, how we respond to this moment, will define who we are as a nation far more than any speech or slogan ever could. If you found this video valuable, if you believe this story matters, hit that like button. Subscribe to the Oracle Vision channel because we're going to keep covering this story as it develops. We're going to keep telling the truth about what's happening, about who's being hurt, about what's at stake. Share this video with someone who needs to see it. Leave a comment with your thoughts. And most importantly, don't look away. Don't let this become normal. Don't let exhaustion or cynicism make you indifferent to what's happening. Because Ilhan Omar and the Somali American community in Minnesota deserve better than this. They deserve what every American deserves, to be judged by their character and their actions, not by their ethnicity or national origin, to be treated with dignity by their government, to live without fear that federal agents will pull them over or detain them simply because of how they look or what language they speak. That's not too much to ask. That's not political correctness. That's not partisan politics. That's basic human decency. That's constitutional law. That's American values. And we need to fight for it like our democracy depends on it, because it does.